So just to add to that, from what I understand, because my parents ran away from the Soviet Union back in the day, and we're talking about socialism being the means of government control of production. So there is something being produced, which is kind of like an industry-based economy rather than a service-based economy. So in compare and contrast with the United States, we're not really producing things anymore. That's being done overseas by different governments that aren't capitalist, but we're just becoming a service-based economy. And just America and Soviet Union have a lot of differences because we're more service-based in manufacturing things.
Wow. Well, I would like to say something about that, because that's actually one thing that was pointed out by a writer that I've learned a lot from named Nelson Peary. He wrote a book called The Future is Up to Us, which is a very good book. I encourage people to read it. And he talks about the fact that, as you talk about these revolutions in stages, every new revolution began with that economic revolution, the new mode of production, right? But the Russian Revolution did not have a new mode of production. It was simply capitalist industrial production organized according to a state central plan. The steel mills in the Soviet Union functioned in the same way the steel mills in the United States operated. There was not a new economic system. And Nelson Peary argues that the reason that ultimately the Soviet Union didn't last is because it did not represent a higher stage of production, right? And that if you look throughout the time of feudalism, there were plenty of times where people did what the Narodniks did. And they rose up, they seized control of their land, and they reorganized feudalism in a more egalitarian and fair way. But eventually, the old feudal system would come and take them over because they didn't have a new mode of production, right? And that ultimately, it's the computer revolution that has created this service economy. That's the reason that we don't have industrial workers at this point, is because those jobs have been eliminated by machines with 3D printing and all of that. And basically the industrial worker is fading away. And Jack Ma, one of the brilliant, he's a billionaire in China, but he's also a brilliant intellectual and a member of the Communist Party. He talks about the fact that basically everything that could be done by a machine is going to be done by a machine eventually. And all that we're going to have left as humans is going to be things that only human beings can do. It's very fascinating, and that ultimately, that lays the basis for a new social order, with the elimination of the industrial worker. And I think that kind of thing is fascinating, as you're pointing out. But that is one reality, is that the Soviet economic system, it was capitalist industrial production, but not capitalist. It was operated according to a state central plan, not for profits. But the steel mills function in the same way. And I think that's a point that ultimately needs to be made, absolutely. And I think that's interesting. And I think that points toward the fact that we're living in an era where capitalism, because it's gotten rid of industrial workers, right? There's no room for millions of people at the assembly line, right? Their ability to be hired to work has been eliminated. As a result, they're not spending, right? Their spending power has decreased. So the capitalists are producing so much stuff more efficiently than ever before. They're churning out iPhones and iPads like never before. But the people of the world, their standard of living is dropping because there's no place for them to get hired and have enough to actually buy it, right? And that this is what Karl Marx wrote about in his book Capital, the problem of overproduction, that the capitalist is constantly driving to make the means of production more efficient, but at the same time, in order to do that, he's lowering the standard of living and reducing the spending power of the worker. And the worker cannot buy back the products that he's being driven so hard to produce. Under previous systems, people were homeless because there wasn't enough housing. Now people are homeless because there's too much housing. Under previous systems, people were hungry because there was food shortages. But now people are becoming hungry because there's too much food. And that's the problem of capitalism, is that we produce not for use and for human need, but for profits, right? I mean, the classic example is that, like, at the end of the night in a lot of restaurants, right? They'll take the food that's left over and they'll throw it in the garbage. But instead of just walking away and leaving it there in the garbage, they'll take motor oil and pour it all over it. Why? Because if some homeless person eats it out of the garbage, then they're not going to go spend at the restaurant, right? They didn't produce that food for people to eat it. They produced that food to make money off of it, right? That's the irrationality of capitalism, and it can only be resolved with the means of production being controlled by the state in order to stop that irrationality. And the fact that we have a service economy and that the industrial worker is becoming a thing of the past lays the basis for a higher social system to come into being. Absolutely. That's my response to that.
Yeah, in 1991, Donald Trump introduced the term fair trade instead of free trade. And as a Donald Trump supporter, I agree with a lot of fair trade.
I think that's been around before, though. I mean, the anti-globalization protests in the 1990s were talking about fair trade, not free trade, and I mean that's a long-standing critique of globalization. You know, is this understanding that it's a global race to the bottom, right? It's the playing countries in the world against each other, lowest wages, lowest living. You know what I'm saying? That's globalization. What capitalism has become in the 1990s and later. This global economy where a single item might be produced in 25 different countries, right? Where all the workers are competing for who will work for the cheapest. You know what I mean? That global system, which I think people on the right call it globalism, right? But Lenin wrote a whole book about it called Imperialism, where the world is ruled by a small group of bankers based in the Western countries. That is ultimately what socialism is trying to resolve and change, by having society and countries take control of their economies and rationally operate them.
Yeah, because fair trade introduces the idea of you actually help the poorer countries. If they have something that we could get from them, we give them something that they might need in return. It's a lot different than, instead of purely being for profit, you're doing what's best to develop other countries at the same time. But it's not a matter of just giving away wealth or wealth redistribution. It's doing it in a smarter way where you could focus on smaller economies to grow themselves.
Sounds kind of like what China's doing with the One Belt, One Road initiative.
A little bit.
Yeah, where China's going to developing countries and building infrastructure and raising up the standard of living and stimulating the domestic economy. And then there's more of a domestic economy for them to trade with. So they make more money, and that country has more of a domestic economy, and their businesses grow, and both countries kind of grow together. They call it win-win cooperation.
Yeah, they're doing that in Ethiopia. They're building highways, hotels, gas stations, and they're just building an economy, and they might even trap those countries by making them owe debt to China. But at the same time, Ethiopia is really going to evolve.
Well, and that's the crazy thing is, you hear them, that's the allegation leveled against China is that, oh, they're going to, trap all these countries in debt. But, the IMF and the World Bank have been doing that for years. You know what I mean? They've done it to this country, they've done it to Mexico, they've done it to all of South America. I mean, so then it's like, well, China, there's this allegation that maybe hypothetically China might be doing it when the United States has been blatantly doing it for years but very interesting, yeah. And this is why I think people should revisit Lenin's book Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, where he talks about this and how these international conglomerates, these global corporations get formed that kind of dominate the world. Exciting stuff.
Yeah.
Anything else?
I just thought it was interesting that you mentioned his imperialism, because I'm personally a lot of my study is fascinated by the creation of the global South, particularly in the Caribbean, and as you know, for most of my academic career, my case study has been Haiti, and that's why I find a lot of the talk about this trade to be very interesting, because Haiti in particular has been a victim of a lot of this this economic imperialism, particularly from the West, but also of France and Germany at different points in Haiti's history. So I find, part of the reason that I admire China's initiative is because it doesn't have that vampiric level to it, where it's not, necessarily sucking the resources out of the country, and when providing resources, giving it to the select few, which has been traditionally the issue with global imperialism.